بدأ عرض فيلم جيمس بوند الجديد في دور السينما بشخصية العميل 007 للمرة الأخيرة.
I've worked in a few different countries and currently working in Iraq, and everyone knows James Bond is, you know? Some of these people don't even have a TV.
As I grew older, I went and watched every single one of them that came out. The Spy Who Loved Me, From Russia with Love. They never stopped.
My name is James Lee Bond. I'll be 87 the 5th day of September. I just never did care for James Bond on his movies. It wasn't my prototype.
When the first James Bond movie hit our city, I was in the 7th grade. If you were in the Assemblies of God Church, you didn't go to movies. It was forbidden. But suddenly, I picked up a new nickname. I became 00. But to be honest with you, I was such a dork, the girls didn't flock to me anyway.
It'd be like to share your name with legendary movie spy James Bond. Australian director Matthew Bauer explores that conundrum in his hugely entertaining documentary, The Other Fellow, coming to SBS On Demand here in Australia from December 10 and through Gravitas Ventures in the US in 2023. Joining us on screen watching from the very Fleming-esque Bali setting is Matthew Bauer. Thank you for your time, mate.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, the somewhat GoldenEye-esque setting is a bit of an accident this morning, but you know, it kind of goes with the theme of the film a bit.
It really does. And like, I got to say, before we get onto the film per se, that you're a bit of a Bond figure yourself, choosing the glamorous life of jet-setting documentary maker, studied in New York City, living in London, globe chopping from Scandinavia to Indiana for your first feature, and we catch you in Bali. It's good being Matthew Bauer, isn't it?
Yeah, it's all right. Yeah, I mean, I was always a Bond fan. You know, I mean, I started this journey kind of as just a massive Bond fan, and I think growing up in Adelaide, Australia, the appeal of the Bond films definitely was that kind of globe-trotting-y kind of thing. And maybe I have chosen a bit of a career that kind of allows a touch, a touch of that. Yes, yeah.
It's standard interview question 101, so forgive me, but I am genuinely intrigued how the premise for the film came about.
Sure. I mean, it started by me typing James Bond into the Facebook search bar, because I just kind of I just had that kind of thought of like I wonder what it would like to be James Bond. I typed it into the search bar, and the first thing I discovered was that you can't actually find these guys in that way because Facebook doesn't allow you to join as James Bond. And they told me this, and I tried it myself, and it actually doesn't. And so all the characters in my film are called Bond James or JB Bond or Jimmy Bond. One of them is actually James with 3 S's Bond. Oh, wow. On Facebook. So once I figured out that rubric, I then checked to see if they had other Bonds there who I would assume as in their friend list, which would make me assume they were actually from the Bond family and their name was probably James. And then I sent them a spam email just kind of saying, hey, I'm thinking of making this film. Have you got any stories? You know, and I was expecting to hear most of what we actually burned through in the first 10 minutes of The Other Fellow, which is everything you'd expect, the martini jokes, picking up women, all those things you expect. But actually the first one who wrote back to me, and I have to dance around spoilers quite carefully.
I want to avoid spoilers, because that's part of the joy of the film.
The first Bond who wrote back to me was actually the final James Bond who you only meet in the final minutes of The Other Fellow. And when he told me his story, and then plus the other stories I was hearing from the other people, I kind of realized there was a whole film that worked backwards from that point that you could tell.
Documentarians, I guess, like no other filmmaker, make enormous leaps of faith that their ideas are going to turn into interesting films. And how far away from what you were expecting did The Other Fellow ultimately become?
In the end, it was actually pretty close to what we were kind of expecting to do in the first place. I mean, definitely what appealed to me is, yes, there's the whole men named James Bond thing, you know, but what actually appealed to me was it's a film about a group of men who are connected digitally and almost spiritually to what we call the James Bond phenomena, you know. And the James Bond phenomena isn't about the plot of Skyfall. It's the fact that he's on the side of every bus, he's on TV all the time, and that, you know, these men are literally surrounded by the noise and airwaves of a massive multimedia franchise. And so I almost saw it as an almost like sort of like science fiction-y kind of concept, and that was kind of always the idea. And then you know, it's weird when you kind of do films like this, you know, you kind of go down a lot of different routes, especially in documentary, of how you're going to structure it, and actually in the end it's actually pretty close to what we were trying to do in the first place.
Wow, that's cool. That's very cool. I've watched the film. I'm about, as we record this interview, I'm about 80 minutes having watched the film, so it's still sort of swirling around in my head.
Right.
The privilege of personal identity is how I describe a major theme of The Other Fellow. Not knowing how important one's right to define your own identity is. It was really driven home to me watching this movie. Can you comment on that? Am I sort of on target there?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny with the identity thing, and I think a lot of it in the kind of promotion of this, people often talk about the identity kind of aspect of this, and I think it does speak to a lot of things about you know, male identity, masculine identity, as well as sort of like sexual and even kind of racial identity, you know, and gender identity, actually, in some ways. For me as a filmmaker, that was kind of always in the background. I always got those things were going on with this film, but that doesn't really actually give me that much to work with on a minute by minute basis. What actually interested most in this film is the actual literal identity parts. You know, there's a sequence you see in the film about what it's like when the James Bonds get pulled over by the police.
Oh.
And if your name is James Bond, you must carry ID on you at all times. And it's for the reason that if you get pulled over by the police and you don't have your ID and they ask you what your name is and you say James Bond, you'll kind of you'll get arrested. And they all kind of told me this similar story. And then there's another story in the film about how a man named James Bond is arrested for murder. But then another man who has the same identity, as in who's also called James Bond in the same town, starts getting phone calls at his office, and then there's a blowback to him. And so, what interested me more in this film was literally how all that actual identity stuff, like your digital identity, your how that kind of connects and causes kind of, especially in the digital age, all these kind of unexpected problems. So yeah, there is of course the overarching theme of kind of male identity, but I think that in our editing room we were never having that conversation. We were going, how do we explain how this thing happening over here can connect through literal identity to this other person?
I'm going to go off my questions here for a second and just say that sequence with the two James Bond, the murder suspect and the other one who's caught up in that had very thin blue line elements to it, a very feel to it, that the Errol Morris film, which is one of my favorite ever movies. So that absolutely connected to me. I know you've spoken that Morris is an influence of yours. Name some of the others that the team at NYU in New York at the school sort of impressed upon you.
Yeah, I mean, definitely Errol Morris, while I was at NYU, was a big kind of discovery for me, and I absolutely love his films. And you know, we use the same like Interatron system we actually found a really cheap Interatron system in Sydney that actually uses, someone makes in Sydney, it's a device that uses an iPad to really kind of cheaply set up an Interatron setup with the camera.
Oh wow.
But yeah, so we really kind of wanted to ape that sort of Errol Morris style, and then you know, this film employs reenactments really kind of extensively, which obviously was his invention for the thin blue line as well. And then we obviously really wanted to push those reenactments into almost like James Bondy kind of territory. But this film actually is an Errol Morris film in the way it's done. And so he was a really big inspiration for this. And again, you know, I have to dance around spoilers here, but the main character of the film, who you won't have seen in any of the trailers or the marketing, when I met them, they reminded me a lot of an Errol Morris character. And as soon as I'd met them, I was like, oh wow, that's the person who this film can kind of center around. And yeah, specifically the main character in like Tabloid, I thought they had a kind of similar sort of vibe to one of those real sort of Errol Morris characters. They're very regional. as well. You can really pick which part of the world they're coming. Normally with Morris, it's the American South or something like this, whereas for us, it's like England. But that really kind of, at that moment when I met them, I was like, oh wow, we really do have like a bit of an Errol Morris thing going on here. And then obviously with the entire kind of crime aspect of the film, we really kind of wanted to play sort of in that sandbox kind of as well. So yeah, definitely he has kind of a big impact on this. I think the final film, it wouldn't really occur to you how much of an Errol Morris film this is unless you really kind of think about it.
Yeah.
I think it definitely, in terms of interview on Interatron archive reenactment, it's working with the same kind of toolbox.
And wonderfully so. Yeah, it's a terrific sort of piece of documentary filmmaking. You touched on this point in an earlier answer, but I just want to return to it. It's fascinating that James Bond, the brand, is that traditional sort of alpha heterosexual white male fantasy ideal, a sort of time capsule of masculinity, yet the range of Bonds you profile, I think, sort of point to the ridiculousness of that early Bond notion and almost deconstruct that which is also built up in the film.
Yeah, I mean, I think our film has this very kind of diverse range of James Bonds in the film, and I think you know, weirdly enough, we weren't trying to kind of tick some kind of woke boxes here by having homosexual and African American James Bonds. Well, the reason for that is, you know, James Bond is this, you know, archetype of, you know, the ultimate kind of like male fantasy, you know, and he's very much associated with being this sort of, you know, white kind of British man. And so we really wanted to find characters who were the opposite of that, because by being the opposite of that, it kind of created the most drama. And so it became naturally interesting to see what it was like for a homosexual to have this name when he would be so associated with the most famous heterosexual man in the world. And of course, what it would be like for an African American to be constantly compared to, you know, if you will, the most famous white man in the world. And so those kind of diverse aspects sort of came out of that, you know. And also that, you know, you look right now, they're trying to select a new James Bond, and you have, of course, all these, you know, incredibly right-wing media pieces. You know, the Daily Mail or the Sun love to quote a source who has told them that the new James Bond is going to be Idris Elba, or the new James Bond is going to be a homosexual, or the new James Bond is going to be a woman. Yeah. And of course, the producers of the Bond films have never said this. It's completely made up. But I think what's interesting is that, you know, that really does exist in our culture, these conversations of what James Bond is and what James Bond isn't, you know, whether that's on toxic Facebook pages or not is another story, but the conversation definitely exists. And I think we wanted our film to really sort of play, you know, into that through the selection of its characters. Yeah.
I'm going to break the interviewer's rule here and tell a quick personal story. Back in 2009, Armando Iannucci, he directed In the Loop, and Tom Hollander plays this idiot politician in the film called Simon Foster. And he spends the whole film getting torn to shreds by Peter Capaldi. So hearing my name being, and actually wrote a sort of an op-ed piece on it for SBS here in Australia, hearing my name being carved up on screen was hilarious, of course, but also a little bit shocking, like to hear your name being taken apart and taken advantage of like that. So I'm certainly not comparing myself to anyone in the film, but I kind of got what some of these people were saying.
No, I mean, it was really cool that at our Melbourne premiere, we actually had a guy called James Bond. His wife dragged him along to come see the film. But what we found surprising is actually the film has really resonated with so many people who have like a funny name, you know. And it's funny you say that. We spoke with a guy called Josh, who's one of Australia's top James Bond fans, who does another podcast. But actually, where the film really connected with him is his name is Josh Gay. And so he spent his life, and he's a straight man, but he spent his life receiving a torrent of homophobic slurs throughout his entire life because of his name. And so I think that really connected with him in that way. And I think it has brought up for a lot of people, you know, who were teased about their name at school, you know, who aren't named James Bond, but who have had these other kind of strange things. And yeah, I understand with the Simon Foster thing. And like often most people have got those things where, you know, someone in a film has had the same name as them, you know, or even, you know, there's that time we all receive an email that's to someone else who has our same name.
Yeah.
By mistake. And I think that connects with a lot of people in this film. And I think it has made people think a lot about just their name and their identity in a way that you often kind of normally wouldn't.
It's such a wonderful film, mate. It's called The Other Fellow, like I say, on SBS On Demand here in Australia from December 10, and hopefully theatrically through the US with Gravitas. Is that the plan for the film?
Yes, it's currently going to be released theatrically early next year in the US. It's also getting a cinema release in Sweden, which is awesome, given that our film completely randomly is 1/4 Swedish because
It really is, yes.
of the Swedish James Bond in the film. But I think probably because he's in that, yeah, it's also coming out in Sweden, and a bunch of other territories I think are being announced pretty soon as well.
That's very exciting. Finally, mate, I got to ask you, and it's kind of a pat question, but my choice for the next James Bond is Daryl McCormick, who was in Thank You, Good Luck to You, Leo Grande. I think he's on. They'll buff him up, of course, but I think he'll be the next James Bond. Do you have a favorite?
To be the next James Bond? My answer to that question is the next James Bond will be whoever Barbara Broccoli and Michael G. Wilson, and maybe now Amazon, who are the owners of the James Bond films, will decide. I mean, I do find it hilarious. You have these articles about how the odds like the odds where you can bet at the betting shop on the new James Bond have like changed, like as if this is some kind of like an election or something like that. So yeah, I always say that the next James Bond will be who the producers of the new James Bond film select. Yes. So yeah, I guess we'll see.
We'll see. All right, mate. Thank you. It's lovely to talk to you. Good luck with the film, and congratulations. It's a great piece of work.
Cool. Thank you very much.